Focus on the result, not the pathway. What I'm recommending is you be purpose-driven. The result is your purpose, not path-driven. So you be purpose-driven, not path-driven. A real common way that you've heard this most of your life is to keep your eye on the ball. Stephen Covey wrote about it in one of his 7 Habits for Highly Effective People when he said, begin with the end in mind. And I'm recommending you not only begin with the end in mind, but you keep the end in mind until the end is clear and is in front of you. You be clear about what you want. Because I believe that most people, including me often, have a very ineffective habit, which is too much focus on the way to get there, or the hows to get something. Now, the problem with focusing on how is we usually focus on one how. But even when we change that and focus on multiple hows or multiple action plans, that's a step up, but I think there's still too much time that many of us spend on those hows. For example, I really took to heart when I was learning softball to keep the eye on the ball, because I remember in the beginning I heard a lot of instructions about how to hold the bat, how to swing the bat, and in the beginning I put my attention on the bat and on my hands, and I missed the ball constantly until, of course, one of those great coaches said, hey, keep your eye on the ball. When I first was being taught to golf, I remember this clearly. Again, how to hold the club and how to swing the club and how to stand and where to put my shoulders. And oh my gosh, pretty soon all I could think about was anything but the ball. And guess what? I was terrible. This is also when I first learned to sail. I'm still not. I still don't do any of these things very well. But when I first learned to sail, again, the instruction was all about how to move the sail, and all the geometry and the wind and what all that did. But really, I believe that when you put your attention on the spot near the horizon that you're wanting to go, your subconscious will take over and handle the way to get there, particularly if you have, at one point, focused on the ways. Well, we get into situations thinking that we know the way, and then we too often get stuck. Organizations do this all the time. I think nonprofit organizations, even businesses, but let me go to nonprofits for a minute. Nonprofits that are there to end poverty sometimes get stuck in competition. So, they get stuck in not the result that they want, but some method that is common in any organization, which is competition. Even for-profit companies. Yeah, I understand competition works sometimes, but I believe that if for-profit companies really keep their eye on either their profit or serving their customers, they're going to go a lot further than if they're keeping their eye on beating their competitors. Schools that keep their eye on teaching students, I think, get further than when they keep their eye on testing students. Governments that are there to protect countries sometimes go to war and destroy them because they haven't kept their eye on the ball. Well, as you know, the style of coaching we provide emphasizes what do you want, or the result to be produced. And that's what I recommend you keep coming back to. Now, I realize that we talk about coming up with multiple action plans, so when you come up with those multiple action plans, it may seem sensible to put your attention on implementing the action plan. Well, again, I'm suggesting not. Once you come up with the action plan, then put your attention back on what you want and trust your subconscious to take the best actions selected from all those action plans to arrive at that. Now, how do you keep your eye on the ball? How do you keep your eye on the result, not the pathways? Well, first of all, set up daily reminders. Daily reminders that are written reminders or that are graphic reminders. And then also enlist your community. Tell your community what your results are. Not the ways in which you're going to get there, but what are the results you're wanting to achieve. If you run an organization, keep reminding all the members of your organization the main purpose, your main goals, the main results. In your family or in your church, keep reminding your relatives or the people in your church of your most important values and goals. It's one of the things that I think is great about many churches. They're there to help people remember what's most important to them. Well, I think you got this idea, and I do want to give a couple more practical examples. And for example, health, and in particular losing weight. There seem to be more experts on this subject than almost any other subject. So many people have a suggestion for how to lose weight. What are the pathways to losing weight? And of course, some of those work and some of them don't. But what I see is too many people who want to lose weight put their attention on the pathway instead of the scale, instead of the result. I believe that when you keep your attention on the result, you're more likely to produce it. Investing money in the stock market, boy, everybody has got a different theory and a different pathway to make money. And a lot of those people use those pathways to ruin themselves financially because they're sure they're right. Sometimes this occurs in religion, that we think that we know the way rather than know the end result. Or relationships, we make up hows of having a great relationship instead of looking over there and saying, is the person across from me in better shape than when they arrived? You know, how's the person across from me, the person who I want to develop a relationship, how are they doing? And if they're doing great, wonderful. Keep doing what you're doing. Or do something else to have them feel even greater. And if they're not doing great, then shift what you're doing and see what to do to produce the result called better relationship, instead of following some rule or some past way that worked. Same with business success or political success. Well, that's the idea. Now, what I'd like to do is get a couple of questions about this, and then I've got a quick exercise with regard to it. So if you have a question, would you please press 2 on your keypad? And I notice a couple of you have already pressed 1, but hey, this is just for the fun of it. Take your 1 and turn it into a 2, and I'll call on you. Thanks a lot, Catherine. Go ahead. Catherine, you're on.
Oh. Did I press a 2?
You did, or now you've pressed
what's
a 3.
So funny?
But
I'm wearing my phone. It must have. I pocket dialed you, Dave.
Well, Catherine, you are so sharp that I'll bet you got something to say about what I just said, even though you didn't intend to.
I do. I have a question. It's more likely a comment because I actually am one of those experts in weight loss that has multiple pathways to help people to get there. And I do think there's something to be said for keeping your eye on the goal, the number, and really getting clear about that number. So I think there's advice that's good advice. I do, because I think people often get distracted or invested in their story about why things aren't working instead of really getting clear about what it is they want to work. So I think that's great. It's a great comment.
Thanks, Catherine. And I love what you just said. We get invested in our story about why it doesn't work. And I believe we also get invested in our story about why it does work. And then we forget about making it work. We just remember the story. I recalled a story this morning that I haven't told for a long time, and it was about my wife Karen, my first wife Karen. This when we were first married, and it's before I became a vegetarian for 17 years, and she used to cook roasts. And any time she cooked a roast, she would cut it in half, put it in the pan, and bake it, cook it. And I asked her once, I said, my mom didn't cut roasts in half. Why do you do that? She says, I don't know. That's what I learned. That's what my mom did. And I said, well, that's interesting. So I went to her mother. Her mother's name was Enzi. And I asked Kenzie, why do you cut roasts in half before you cook them? And she says, I don't know, because Millie did it, my mother. So I went to Millie and I said, Millie at the time was really old, and I said, why? And she just laughed and laughed and laughed. She says, well, I always did it because I didn't have a big enough pan.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's what we do, We make up these stories, and they don't have anything to do with creating the result, but we get attached to the story. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Catherine. Pete, I see you've got a one on your. You punched a one. You got a question or a comment about this?
Well, I'll turn it into a question. And what's the balance between subconscious and conscious? So I liked what you said, that maybe you've taken time to come up with all the various hows, and I think quite often I find myself or clients or friends or family focusing on maybe one or two as opposed to the multitude. But also I love this idea of your subconscious working and you being and doing, not even maybe planning it, but placing yourself in situations that actually help you to get your end result. And so I guess, do you find it to be a balance between going back and forth? Or, I don't think I've ever heard you say this.
Well, I'm glad you haven't heard me say it, Peter, because that's my goal, is to speak and say some things I've never said. And I'm not really recommending a balance here so much as a huge shift from focusing on pathways when you're in action to focusing on the result. So there's certainly a time, let's go back to the analogy of golf. There's certainly a time to figure out all the different ways you can swing the golf club better, and even write them down, and have someone help you, and even practice some of those ways. But then when it actually comes to swinging and being in the game, I'm recommending forget all those ways. Let your subconscious know those ways. So it's not even a balance, it's just a turning all of it over once you're on the field, and just focus on the result. Let me do a non-sport example. Let's say you want to get along with somebody, so you want to improve your relationship with somebody. Certainly there's a time to make a list, a long list, at least 20 or more items of all the multiple ways you could improve your relationship. And describe those in detail, and maybe even practice some of those, and rehearse some of them with yourself or with a coach, or so you're on the practice. But then when you get on the field with the person you want to improve the relationship with, let go of all those rules or even all those multiple action plans. So you're not there to implement an action plan. You're there to produce a result. Now, in the process of producing that result, I think those actions are going to come forth, those ones you practiced or those ones that worked. But if you go into that relationship with the idea of, okay, I'm going to implement these actions, then I think your focus and attention could be diverted and you're thinking about the actions instead of looking out there with your eye on the ball, or in this case, your eye on the other person, and saying, hey, am I producing the result? Is the relationship improving? Great question, Peter. Thanks. Got time for one more question and then an exercise. Would somebody else please raise your hand? And just raise your hand electronically by hitting 1. Another advantage to having you ask a question or make a comment about this is that it gets your voice present. And everybody hears you. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm looking at my multiple action plans for my fundraiser, and my clarification is when I put most of my focus on what I want, does it mean I'm putting my focus on the end result, or is it also mean that I put my focus on what I want to do in the action plan? Because I have multiple action plans, and some of them I want to do, and others I'm just like, eh.
Well, I think that the end result can be either a circumstance, like in your example, more money raised, or an action. And so a result can also be an action or a way of being. So, for example, in fundraising, the circumstance or the having result might be more money raised. The doing result might be that fun is going to be had while you're going to do this in a joyful, light, enjoyable way. And a being goal might be that you will inspire others. So all those are results. I'm recommending you keep your eye there. You could even have action plans to achieve each one of those results. The results are what you focus on. So yeah, the results can be in the domain of doing, or being, or having. Being, the attitudes, the values you express in this fundraising. Doing, the actions that you take, that are the kinds of actions that you want to take. And then having, the circumstances that you want to create. Thanks a lot, Rosemary. Now, for each of you, what I'd like to do is have you do a discovery intention. Look into your own life and write down where in your life are you putting too much attention on the pathways. So as is up on the screen, you'll say, I discovered that I, and then you'll look at some area of life and see, are you putting too much attention on the pathways instead of the result? And then, afterwards, write an intention. And of course, the intention could just be, I'm going to put more attention on the path, on the result, but I'd like you to have that intention be in more detail, like what you intend to do and the ways in which you intend to do it. I'm going to give you a minute to, actually I'm going to give you 70 seconds because I really want you to be thoughtful here, be able to write one or two discovery statements. Now, let's say that you don't even like this idea that I've just presented. No problem. You can write down, I discovered that I would rather put my attention on the pathways, or whatever it is that you're discovering about yourself. So I'll give you 70 seconds to write, and we'll get into groups again. We're going to have you move into similar groups as before and share these. But first of all, 70 seconds, please write. All right. Now, I want to make one caveat, two caveats, and then we'll be done. And the first caveat is that this is not about being addicted to your goals or attached to your goals. Because I believe that when you are attached, sometimes people call it too goal-oriented. Because I think sometimes when we call ourselves too goal-oriented, or when we label someone else as too goal-oriented, what we mean is that they are holding the goal. They're not holding it lightly. They are attached to it. They've got to have it, or their well-being is no longer well. So that's not the idea. The idea is, yes, you keep your focus on it, and you pay attention to it, and one of the processes that we use is non-attachment or lightening up. The other caveat to this, because I want to say what I'm not saying, is about persistence. Because when Stan and I first started talking about this, Stan says, well, what about being persistent in the multiple action plans? Well, that's not the idea of persistence. Persistence is to be persistent in achieving the result that you want, even in the face of failure. And you keep that persistence until you legitimately have lost desire. but not when you just lost success. So that when you're unsuccessful, that doesn't stop the persistence toward the result. When you've totally lost desire toward the result, okay, well then move on to a different result. But I'm not recommending persistence in the ways in which to achieve the result. Because there again, I think that's what we call being dogmatic.